This episode is brought to you by Arc'teryx. When Jordan Cannon, a young climber infatuated with climbing history, meets climbing legend Mark Hewden, a Yosemite big wall free climbing pioneer, they form an unlikely partnership around a common goal. Jordan wants to free climb the Freerider on El Cap in a day, and Mark hopes to free the route in as many days as it takes and accomplish his lifelong goal of free climbing El Capitan. Follow their story in Free as Can Be, a short climbing film brought to you by Arc'teryx. I watched the film a few weeks ago. It's 31 minutes long. It's so well done. It's a story of climbing partnership and adventure. And if you love this podcast, and especially if you loved my episode with Jordan Cannon, episode 115, then I know you'll love the film. So check it out. Head over to YouTube and search for Arc'teryx, Free as Can Be, or use the direct link right there in your podcast app to watch the full 31-minute film for free. Once again, you can head over to YouTube and search for Arc'teryx, Free as Can Be, or use the direct link right there in your podcast app to watch the full 31-minute film for free. Arc'teryx presents Free as Can Be, and we hope you enjoy the film. This episode is also brought to you by Rhino Skin Solutions. This stuff is my go-to when it comes to taking care of my skin for climbing. I use the repair cream almost every single night, all the time. I use it multiple times a night if I'm climbing in a sharp and crimpy area, like in Waco Tanks or in Leavenworth or at Smith Rocks. If I come home from a day of climbing and my skin's torn up, I wash my hands and then I apply the repair cream several times throughout the evening. And it really does wonders for helping my skin heal faster and getting me back on the rock the next day. If you want to level up your skin game, head over to Rhino Skin Solutions to check out their great line of products and enter code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off your next order. That's rhinoskinsolutions.com. Use code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off your next order. And if you want to learn more about how to use Rhino products, it seems really simple on the surface, I'm sure, but there's a lot of nuance to this stuff, how to dial your skin in for a specific rock type, for instance, if you're going to go on a trip. I recorded an episode with Justin Brown, the founder of Rhino, who's a friend of mine, way back in episode 22. I still think it's a great episode, so you can go check that out to learn more. One final time, rhinoskinsolutions.com. Use code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off the best skincare products in the game. And finally, this episode is brought to you by Shortform. Shortform gives you the highest quality book summaries in the world. Shortform summaries contains the book's key ideas, but they also have interactive exercises and add smart insights and analyses to the book's summary. I love to read, and I think reading is important, and for sure, nothing can substitute sitting down and actually reading a great book cover to cover. The reason I love Shortform is because it essentially gives you the nuggets from today's top books. How many times have you read an amazing book, learned things that totally blew your mind, only to forget them a handful of weeks later because you didn't take any notes? I have definitely done that. Shortform helps you remember the key lessons from books you've read, as well as discover new books you need to read. Shortform summaries are written by professional authors, PhDs, and Ivy League graduates, so you can trust in writer quality. So join Shortform today and join thousands of curious readers to get smarter faster. Head over to shortform.com/nugget to join me on Shortform for a 5-day free trial and 20% off your annual subscription. That's 5 days of unlimited access for free and 20% off your annual subscription by going to shortform.com/nugget or by clicking the link down below in your podcast app. Learn faster, get smarter with Shortform. Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Nugget Climbing Podcast. This is your host, Stephen Dimmitt, and my guest today is Dr. Rebecca Williams. Dr. Rebecca Williams is a clinical psychologist, a performance coach, and the author of Climb Smarter: Mental Skills and Techniques for Climbing. I'm going to read a short bio from her website. Dr. Rebecca Williams is a consultant clinical psychologist. She started climbing at university and qualified as a clinical psychologist around 20 years ago, and as a climbing instructor not long after that. Since then, she has been coaching climbers on mental skills for climbing, working with hundreds of climbers every year on all aspects of their head game to develop their confidence and improve their climbing psyche. I was really excited to talk to Rebecca. And of course, with head game and mindset, there's so much we can and could have talked about in this conversation. But we decided to really focus this conversation on fear of falling. This was a very deep dive into fear of falling. And it was a very different conversation than any that I've heard around this topic of fear and falling. We went really deep. And the thing that interested me in this topic with Rebecca is that she really goes deep into the fears at the root of fear of falling. There's a bunch of different fears that can manifest as fear of falling. So we got into fear of the sensation of falling, fear of failure, fear of being judged by your peers, fear of fear. That was super interesting. Fear of being out of control, and several other fears and how they interact with one another. And I think you'll be surprised by how helpful this conversation was. It was really helpful for me. I don't feel like fear of falling is a big issue for me at this point, but I still got a lot out of this conversation. We talked about perfectionism and how for most of us climbers, our drive is really overdeveloped, and our self-soothing system, our ability to relax and wind down and calm that anxiety that we feel when we're about to try a hard red point, for instance, that's really underdeveloped for a lot of us. And Rebecca has all the tools. It was super cool. We talked about breathing exercises to reduce anxiety. We talked about some of the pre-climb routines that she likes to give to her clients, how they can be helpful. We talked about meditation and mindfulness and how that can be helpful with fear of falling, depending on what the root cause is, and about shifting our focus from focusing on achievement and sending to a focus on mastery, which I really resonated with and thought was super cool. So, all that to say, I think there's something in this conversation for everyone, regardless of whether or not you feel like fear of falling is something that holds you back in your climbing. And I hope you enjoy this deep dive into fear of falling and head game with Dr. Rebecca Williams. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it.
I feel I need to just let you know, my kids are in the next room, so they're at the office with me. They are watching TV, so chances are they won't bother me for the next 2 days if I leave them to it. But just in case there's a sudden interruption.
Noted. All right. How old are your kids?
5 and nearly 8.
Okay.
Yeah, they're both boys. They're a lot of fun at the moment. The hard bit's kind of over, I feel, and they're into the fun phase.
That's great. Yeah, I don't have kids myself, but I have a nephew and 2 nieces. I have 2 sisters, so different families there, but they're all kind of in the crazy phase right now.
Oh, are they?
They're all between 2 and 5, 2 and 6 now, I guess. So it's just a lot of energy running around. Not fully independent yet, but wanting to be independent.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're pretty cute.
I remember it well. I'm still traumatized.
Sure. Well, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, and you. Yeah. It's been interesting to just think about it from a different perspective, in terms of the book and, also what I might talk about and things. So, and like I said to you last time, it's a really weird thing for me to be in this chair. So I'm looking to you for your interviewing skills.
All right. Okay. Hopefully I can deliver. Yeah, you're used to being in the questioning chair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Asking your clients questions. Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think we can just jump into it unless you have any questions for me before we get started.
No, sure. Let's go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a time cutoff?
No, just when the battery runs out on the iPad next door, probably.
Perfect. Okay. Well, as a way of introducing this conversation, I think it'd be good to start with your background as a clinical psychologist and hear a little bit about that work that you do and how it relates to climbing. But then today's conversation, it's going to be really interesting, I think. I don't normally have, well, I don't know. More often than not, I have conversations that range wildly. You know, I'm interested in the person I'm talking to, and that often, you know, we often touch on many, many different subjects. But I think with you, this is going to be a much more topical conversation, really focusing around fear of falling. And hopefully, and I think it will, I think it'll be a little bit more interesting and hopefully more helpful and broad and also specific than a lot of the other conversations out there about fear of falling, because we usually, as climbers, look at that in a very one-dimensional way. Like, you're afraid, what do you do to work through that? But in this conversation, and something that really interested me in you and your work, is that you really break down fear of falling into many, many subsequent or smaller fears that are at the root of that. There's a lot of different reasons why someone might be afraid of falling, and it just expresses in these different ways. And I'm really excited to dig into it. But yeah, to get started, welcome again. Thanks for being here. And I'd love it if you could just talk a little bit about your background for people listening.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite. I am a clinical psychologist. I trained about 20 years ago. Got my doctorate in clinical psychology, and around the same time I started climbing. And my work was generally with the NHS, which is, you know, the UK Health Service, working with adults and children with learning disabilities or with neurodiversity like autism or ADHD. But I was really interested in climbing. It really grabbed me as a sport. And I also early on got my kind of climbing instructor qualifications, and found that when I was trying to coach movements, I was actually more using my psychology skills. And that kind of led me down this side branch, I guess, in terms of how do you take all that we know about, I guess, helping people with anxiety or self-criticism, you know, or perfectionism. So we take that from the therapy space, and how do we work with it in terms of sport, and particularly climbers? And that was just really fascinating to me. And one of the big things that's really interested me about psychology is moving from what's the evidence and the theory, and what does that look like in the real world, you know? So, and it's, for me, that's the interesting bit, is trying to think about this theory related to this person and their situation, and how do we individualize it? Because psychology is based on kind of, you know, large group samples. This is what works for most people, but what does that look like in an individual in a sport that does have risks associated with it? So that's what kind of grabbed me, I guess. And I started to do that as a kind of adjunct to my main work about 15 years ago, maybe longer than that now, actually thinking about it.
That's great. And now, do you mostly work with climbers, or is it still a mix? It's
still a mix. It's around about a third of my time working with climbers. And then the other third is kind of more usual, straight, you know, psychology, clinical psychology work.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about gymnastics, actually, as a way to further get to know you, and then to connect you as an athlete to this work that you do. Tell me about quitting gymnastics specifically, and then how that showed up later in your climbing. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah,
it was definitely something that came back to haunt me. The reasons why I left gym, and you know, when I was starting to climb, everything was great, and then I hit a point where those kind of demons came back, and it was really interesting for me to actually work through it for myself. You know, how do you apply the psychology to yourself as a climber as well? But the gym story really is, I started gymnastics really young. I was a very sort of diligent, perfectionist child. I trained really, really hard, and I had a lovely group of coaches, so they were very kind of encouraging. But I remember, because I was doing quite well, I got invited to a training camp at a kind of a big team, and it was really, really different there. So I can remember having quite a difficult experience on the vault. So with the vault, what you need to be able to do is have a really good flight onto the vault. So by doing that, you have to pull the springboard away from the vault. So you get a nice flight onto the vault, lots of air, as it were, and then do your trick and then kind of land it. And I can remember the coach being very keen on getting my flight on to be a lot longer. So he was continuously pulling the springboard away from the vault. And I remember getting more and more scared, and that gap between the springboard and the vault just seeming absolutely insurmountable, huge. And trying my best to do it and just having a picture in my mind what I needed to do and not being able to execute it and kind of crashing into the vault. And that was kind of the first injury, I guess, I got. But it was also a really shaming experience because I cried. And I remember the coach saying, there's no point crying. That's not going to help you. Go and do it again. And of course I couldn't. I just had a massive block then about it. And that block started on the vault, but it then gradually progressed to other apparatus. And I think because probably I was training really hard, I was trying really hard to overcome these things, I was just getting injured more and more. So I had this kind of lots and lots of different injuries, nothing career ending, nothing terrible, but lots of niggles. And then just this gradual creeping loss of confidence. And at the time, really, sports psychology, we're talking about, 35 years ago or so, sports psychology was really not really around. And it was very much, I'd lost my bottle. That's how it was described. And it was seen as a kind of...
You lost your bottle?
I lost my bottle, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe
not that
British
helpful.
Phrase. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Exactly. And it was just seen as, that was it. It's permanent, it's finished. Your career's finished. That's it. And I can remember going to my very last competition and like executing really, really well, but a very basic routine and scoring really well for the bits I executed, but just clearly a massive gap between me and my peers then. And really at that point, I tried to keep going a bit with the gym, but, I think the coaches lost interest. I lost interest. I wasn't really able to do the things that I wanted to do. And there's a lot of frustration for me around that. And I gradually kind of exited the sport.
How old were you at the time?
I was just in my early teens. So I'd been in there for quite a long time. It was really heartbreaking actually, because gym had been a massive part of my life. I'm there, 3-4 times a week, really long sessions, lots of friends. And then it was just gone from my life entirely. And I think it really affected my confidence all around, actually, just not being able to do that sport anymore and being very self-critical. And it's only now with hindsight that I can really look back on that and say, actually, there was a series of things that shouldn't have happened there. And had it been happening now, probably I would have got some help sooner to kind of overcome that performance block, which was essentially a kind of choking type episode. But that we're going back. It's ancient history now in that sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that really highlights why the work that you do is so important because, of course, climbers come into the same things. And I mean, it's tragic when someone exits the sport because of that frustration and just hitting some block and not having any tools or any support in moving through it or beyond it or whatever they need to do. How did this show up for you in climbing? What were the parallels there?
Yeah, so I remember a few things, but the first one I remember was needing to... So I was being taken out by a friend who was also an instructor, and he was quite kind of... he was very confident, very like, let's do this, we can do it. And I remember getting up a climb, no problem, and then having to step across a gap. It was more of a little jump. And he had me on a rope, and I could see in his face that he was going to pull me if I jumped. And that really just, all of the gym stuff came flooding back. The thing about the gap and not being in control of my own body, which is what I felt like in the gym, because I felt like I was being compelled, to do this vault that I was scared to do. And the more I hesitated, the more I could see his impatience growing and his desire to pull me over. And I think I just kind of froze there, and it was all kind of came flooding back. So that was the start of it. I then had a really spiky kind of few years where some days I would be really on my game, and other days I'd have a real low, couldn't really climb anything, wouldn't go above a bolt, wouldn't step across anything, various things. And then it would be all okay again. And it took me quite a long time to kind of get my head around that and understand that for me, there was quite a lot of trust issues there that I think came back, all the way to the gymnastics. And also this thing about it was really important for me to be in control and to feel like I had absolute autonomy over what I was doing. Now, climbing's a funny sport because, supposedly there's no rules and no hierarchies and so on, but the kind of is. There's often kind of subtle things, how hard somebody, climbs, maybe the length of time, and, other things like gender perhaps come into play there. And so there can be a sense of somebody else is making the decisions, the leader's making the decisions. We go here, we do this route, and so on. And I think for me, it was really, really important to take charge of my climbing and to box, which kind of came back in climbing.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. I think that's a really, using you as an example in this case, I think is really helpful. And from that, I want to jump into some notes that I have from emails that we had sent back and forth and from our first conversation, and really start to look at fear of falling and then the different fears that are, you said something interesting. You said that fear of falling is really this catch-all term for lots of different fears, and they all kind of show up in climbing in this similar way. But I have like 6 or 7 different bullet points in front of me. I have fear of the sensation of falling. That's pretty self-explanatory. Fear of being out of control, either physically or emotionally. Fear of fear itself. I think that's really interesting. Lack of trust in the gear, in systems, or in the belayer, or in people more broadly. Fear of getting injured. Fear of being socially judged. So yeah, I think this is so great, such a great outline to work off of, to just kind of start to look at each of these and what we can do about them, how people can identify which of those fears is really at the root of their fear of falling, and then we can hopefully talk about tools that people can use. But I'm curious, first off, with the vault and with experiencing that block and the space between the vault and the springboard, which of those fears resonates with you? Which was showing up for you in gymnastics and then later on with climbing? Or was it some combination?
I think it was trust and control. Those two things are really, I didn't trust. This was a new coach to me and I didn't trust him. And that is really, really important. And I think sometimes in climbing, people might use full practice as a shortcut to try and avoid trust issues and addressing them, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's not deliberately, but, often the solution is, well, if you're afraid of falling, then you need to fall off. But if you don't trust your belayer or you don't trust the gear and so on, that's going to be enormously difficult. And actually, you might get over it to a degree, but the trust issues will remain. And the trust is something that takes time as it develops between two people. So skipping back to my gymnastics, I didn't have that trust in my coach. And also as a child, with an adult, I felt very much out of control. So I didn't have any agency in that relationship. So I was clearly saying, I don't want to do this, but I wasn't being listened to. And that kind of popped up for me in the climbing experience that I described, of having to initially just step over that gap. I could see, and it happened to me again, I think, where I was hesitating. I was just above a bolt and I was hesitating with the next moves and trying to figure out what to do. And the same guy, actually, I'd been there quite a long time, hanging on, and he was like,
Sure.
you just need to jump off, just jump, take a rest, you'll be able to do it. And I was really not prepared to do that, but I could sense that, again, he was going to take charge of the situation. And that was absolutely not what I wanted. And I was saying, do not pull me off, do not, and I didn't really have that trust in him because of some of maybe the communication between us, and maybe the length of the relationship. But I certainly didn't feel like I had control though. So I think those two things are really important. And what I realized is when I tried what everyone says is the solution, which is falling practice, I could fall off or I could jump off till the cows come home, but what really I struggled with was the unpredictability and doing that with multiple different people, So if I had one climbing partner that I really trusted, it was not a problem, but I couldn't just fall off with anyone. And it just made me begin to realize that, fear of falling and jumping off, they don't necessarily correlate that well. It's not always the right solution. There may be other ways to manage an anxiety that shows up around falling. And it doesn't always cure the problem, I guess.
That's great. And you just touched on this, but I want to ask this question. and just start to hear a little bit more about your philosophy as far as like, if a climber comes to you and they have one of these fears and it's expressing in fear of falling, how you learn more about them and then how you start working on this with them. But yeah, why is it important to identify which fear it is that's at the heart of the fear of falling? I guess what I'm getting at is, does it really change the solution that much, the approach that we use? It must. I mean, that's why you do what you do. But I'd love to hear just a little bit more about your philosophy there and how I don't know, some of your experiences with different athletes, and we can start to get into different ways to work through and tackle each of these different fears. But yeah, why is it so important to identify which one it is?
This is like a really big and complicated question that I'm going to try really hard to give some straightforward answers to, but it might not end up that way. But if I start off maybe with a bit of an anecdote. So when I was training as a psychologist, I had a conversation with my supervisor about a woman he had worked with who had a worm phobia. Now, this feels like it's very off tangent, but I promise I'll come back into the climbing.
I trust you.
And so he was explaining to me that he'd used a very traditional, treatment for phobias, which would be kind of systematic desensitization. So this is gradually getting used to being around worms until this woman could hold a worm. Now, this woman had had a very difficult experience with a worm, very sort of traumatic, shaming experience as a child, and she'd gradually started to avoid worms and then any situation where a worm might appear. Okay, so that could be going out in the garden, going to parks, going out in the rain, going near blackbirds because they pat for worms. And her phobia had kind of grown over time. And when this, my supervisor saw her, she was in her 50s and decided she was going to get some help. But I really remember at the time thinking, why did she need to hold a worm? Because nobody really needs to hold a worm, do they?
Right.
Yeah, she just needed to be able to go out in her garden or to go out in the rain. And I think circling back to climbing, for a lot of people, the gap between what they can do on a top rope and what they can do, their absolute, lead ability, there's a huge gap there. So my question would be, do you really need to hold the worm? Do you absolutely need to climb at your limit and have that possibility of falling off? Because if you don't, why would you go straight into falling practice? There are lots of other ways of managing anxiety first. So that's the first thing. It's not always the right solution. It's not always necessary to go into that. And it's quite a risky practice, falling practice, because you can very easily condition more fear. And that's partly, I think, because people don't necessarily understand how to do it right. So the key thing for falling practice is you need to be relaxed while you do it. And a lot of people, what I see is they've tried to do it in a very tense kind of way. They're worried about doing it. They're scared. They don't necessarily want to do it, but they feel they should. And so they're carrying a lot of body symptoms of anxiety with them. And that's just conditioning more sort of fear with it. The other thing is, for people who are climbing easier routes, it is quite risky physically as well. You have more ledges, more chances to hit things, more possibility of injury. So, is it absolutely necessary to do that? Are there other ways of managing your anxiety that can get you closer to the performance so that you can enjoy climbing without necessarily having to be right at your limit all the time? So that would be the first thing. In terms of differentiating between the different fears, again, if it's just a fear of the sensation of falling, then you could do any kinds of jumping off, falling practice and get used to it, and that would be fine. So that does work for a number of people, where they trust the gear, they trust the belayer. They're not worried about becoming emotional in front of other people and the judgment that might bring for them. They just don't like the sensation. And so it's possible to kind of get used to it.
In that example, that would just be kind of what you talked about with the worm, right? Just like taking slightly bigger falls, just kind of desensitizing and conditioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, gotcha.
And that's relatively straightforward if it's done right. Mm-hmm. But again, you need to differentiate. So jumping off, which is what most people call falling practice, is not the same as actually falling off, because when you jump, you're still in control. So if control is an issue for you, then jumping is not going to work. You need to do unplanned unplanned falls. That's part of it. But if it's more about the fear of the fear, then there are other approaches which are more about learning to tolerate difficult emotions that are maybe more effective than just doing some jumping off. Because even when you're still practicing falling, even if you're doing kind of unplanned falls, maybe sometimes you're still going to have a big emotional response, and that's going to be very upsetting and unsettling for you if it worries you. And that is the thing that maybe we need to work on. So there's a few different strands here. And I think for some people as well, there's issues around, falling off means that I am not able to do something. And that is inviting criticism or judgment from other people or from themselves. But that will show up not just around falling. It will show up in terms of maybe being very perfectionist about sequences, or climbing in a very sort of, being overly precise. It shows up in different ways, not just around the kind of the falling. So even if you tackle the falling, if you haven't tackled this idea that we have to climb perfectly all the time, you're still not going to make much progress. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it definitely does. I'm curious, are there most common fears that you see show up in clients that come to you with fear of falling? Like, are there themes, or is it just all over the place? I mean, we have a bullet list of 6 different fears in front of us that I already talked about. And it seems like there's a lot of like carryover and connections, it's obviously it's not cut and dry. Like, people can show up with multiple of these different fears, or they can be interconnected. But yeah, what do you see most often?
That's a great question. I think quite often it can be fear of fear. So that kind of fear. So, that absolute, I just don't want to have this scary feeling. I don't want to have this difficult feeling. I don't want to have this angry feeling sometimes, or this frustration, but a general kind of fear of feelings. And there's some interesting research out there which talks about climbers using climbing to have a sense of kind of control and agency over their emotions. So if that's a big driver and a motivation for climbing, that we keep putting ourselves in these situations that cause us a measure of anxiety in order to kind of prove to ourselves we can overcome them, that will go well for a certain length of time, but there's always going to be that situation where you really have to bump up against these difficult emotions, because that's life. We can't avoid difficult feelings. For those people, I work in quite a different way. And I'd use a therapeutic approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is very much about allowing feelings to come and go, and grounding yourself in the here and now while you do that. So not letting feelings, I guess, derail us from what's important in our lives. But it's a lot about tolerating those difficult feelings that nobody likes, nobody enjoys having them. But for some people, they're really quite aversive and scary, and they just kind of want to push them away all the time.
Okay. So rather than pushing or just putting your head down and trying to power through, overcoming, it's more about sitting with and accepting and letting yourself feel those feelings.
Yeah. They're just feelings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're just feelings. Yeah. What would a practice look like? Like if someone came into you and that's what they needed to work on, are there things that you're working on in your sessions with these climbers, or are you giving them homework and things to practice when they go climbing? Yeah, what would that look like to start moving towards acceptance of those feelings?
Yeah, so, I mean, it can be different things. It can be kind of practices. It can also be homeworks and so on, or it can be stuff in session. But I guess for that particular group of climbers, what I'd want to do is to find out about their values first. So what is it that's motivating them in the climbing particularly, but also in their life more broadly? What's important to them? And those things that are important to them, are they prepared to tolerate some of the big feelings that might go with that? So we have to have a sense of why we're doing it, and it has to be important enough to work on these, acceptance and tolerance of the feelings. Sometimes people are not so motivated, actually, when they think about it. The climbing or whatever is not as important as they thought it was, But if it is, we want to know why, so that we've got a really clear kind of compass to steer us, through some of these choppy waters of the emotions. Yeah, so having a sense of people's values, that's important. But then some of the practices might be, again, identifying, okay, where do these worries show up, in what situations? And again, having some kind of hierarchy to go through those, teaching some grounding skills. So that might be something, again, related to climbing. It might be a mindfulness type exercise, but it will be related to climbing. And I would want them to just stay in a situation that makes them a little bit uncomfortable. So not super scary, but a little bit uncomfortable. So we might use a thermometer or something, to kind of to grade the worries about fear or the worries about falling or whatever it is. And maybe we want to be kind of not green, a little bit into the amber zone, but definitely not in the red zone. That's too much. And I think that will often show up if people are climbing. Maybe they will climb to the bolt, and the next move above the bolt will be the one that starts to tip them into this, I'm going to get scared, things are going to get more tricky, I'm going to start feeling panicky, I'm really scared about feeling panicky because then I'll be out of control, and so on. It's like a cascade of thoughts and emotions. But what I want them to do is just to stay at that point and to use maybe some breathing techniques or some grounding techniques to allow those emotions to kind of rise and fall until they start to go, they find that actually starts to naturally dip down again and they come back into the green zone. So it's quite similar in a way in the desensitization, but we're learning kind of distress tolerance skills, I guess, as opposed to it's just about falling off, if that makes sense. So these have broader application than just falling.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, it's on the surface or from the outsider. If I was the third person at the cliff, it might look like the same thing, but there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more intention, some breathing exercises and things like that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we wouldn't necessarily need to fall. All we need to do is to get into the bit which people start to feel is difficult or uncomfortable in some way and hang out there. That's all we need to do. Because over time, our feelings will start to dissipate. They may rise a bit first, but they will come down the other side. And learning that skill is massively important. Because like I say, you might overcome it just in terms of falling, but difficult emotions show up every day for people. So we can't always avoid them.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting. I was thinking about my own fear of falling. In anticipation of this conversation and having this list in front of me, I've been kind of just like reflecting and thinking about it. And I find it surprisingly hard to pin down the source of my own fear of falling, and for me, I'm thinking back to, I was probably 22, 23 years old. I was, I was 5 years into climbing. I had been primarily bouldering and never really had to deal too much with fear of falling. Some fear of injury because you hit the ground every time you fall when you're bouldering, but never too much of an issue. But then I switched to sport climbing about 5 years into climbing, and like anyone, just had so much discomfort come up for me starting to lead and starting to push myself on a rope. And I wonder if I'm just going to share more of my experience, and I would love to have you kind of analyze it and we can kind of dig into this. But I remember having a really hard time with fear of falling when I was trying to climb 511s, because for people listening, for context, I had bouldered, V9 at the time or something like that. So I was very capable of climbing 511, but I think it was the control thing for me. I think it was the thought of getting out of control, because I could climb a 511 and for the most part stay in complete control the whole time. But, maybe the crux would start to push me a little bit out of control, and that would really feel scary. And the thing that really helped me was to actually get on harder climbs, because getting on climbs that demanded more of my attention, the movement was difficult enough to demand more of my attention, and I was more inspired by them as well. They were more fun. All of a sudden, I was focused more on the move than I was about what would happen if I didn't stick the move. And then, try the move, and then before I know it, I'm hanging on the end of the rope and it wasn't even a thing,
Yeah.
But having the, I guess, having too big of a buffer, being able to just sit there and hesitate and hang on forever on a 511 because it wasn't as close to my physical limit, it just allowed me to just overthink and just really become concerned about what the fall was going to be like and whether or not it was going to be safe, and just really dwell on like that control thing. So yeah, I don't know. I don't even know what my hope is in sharing all that, but I wonder if you can pinpoint like which of those fears was maybe at the heart of that for me, if it was the control thing or if you're noticing anything else.
The first thing to say is that's super common as well. So, what you're describing there is a focusing issue, isn't it, essentially? So for you, the more you have to focus on the moves and really be mindfully in the moment, you're more flowing and so on. You don't have room for those anxious thoughts. And I think that's another really great example of an intervention which doesn't necessarily involve practicing falling off. It just involves learning how to focus on what you need to focus, which is the climbing, not the thoughts, So I think that's super important. But I'm always really interested with people who switch from bouldering to sport climbing because, and I put my hand up to this myself, I'm much more comfortable bouldering, I think, because I'm totally in control of that. I don't have to rely on anyone else. I don't have to think about any complexity of systems, etc. The trust thing is taken out of the equation essentially with bouldering. It's just you. And maybe also that, again, you're much more likely to be closer to your limits. So you don't have the space to kind of get hooked by some of those anxious thoughts. But I guess I wonder what is it you picture? So if you could run a video of yourself falling off, what would you picture happening? What's the first thing that springs to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on the 511s, like hearing you say that about bouldering, I think is insightful and helps me kind of clarify where I was at the time. Because bouldering, you are by yourself, you are in more control. Even if you know that you're going to fall off and hit the crash pads, like you put them there, and you're going to fall off the boulder straight down to the ground onto the foam. It's just a little bit more predictable, right? Whereas sport climbing, I think one of my sticking points early on was like, okay, who put these bolts there? I trust the bolts, but like they're in a weird spot and I don't know. It was more of an unknown thing, like fear of the unknown. And if I come off on this move, I don't really know what's going to happen. I assume I'm going to fall and be safe, but there's kind of that like weird corner over there that I hope I don't swing into. And there's that little ledge over there that I hope I don't hit. And I think that's what it was. It was just more of a sense of like, I have no idea how this is going to go if I fall off versus if I drop off a boulder, I'm just going to go straight down, hit the foam, just like every other time.
Absolutely. And you might not have chosen to put a bolt there either, is it? If there's certain bits are taken out of your control, essentially, the decision making or whatever. Plus, it's really hard, isn't it, to read a whole route is difficult unless you've rehearsed it a number of times. So you are going to come up with surprises. And I think something with trad climbing as well, sometimes that can be a little easier almost for some people, not for everyone, but for some people with maybe the similar things that I think you and I share in terms of our psychological makeup. The trad climbing can be a little bit easier because you get to choose where you put the gear. So yes, you're a bit limited by the rock, but no one else puts it in for you. You do it yourself. But it also gives you more things to think about again. So I think it can take some of the focus off some of the anxious thoughts. However, that doesn't hold true for a lot of people. A lot of people find, trad climbing more scary than sport climbing. So people really vary in what it is for them. And I think understanding their motivations is really important to find the right kind of intervention for them. So for you, I might have recommended maybe some stuff around some drills where you were out of control, like some speed climbing, for example, where you just go as fast as you can, or something that's relatively easy, to try to kind of simulate that sense of not being in full control of everything. It might be having maybe your belay dictate, or where you put your feet or your hands, so you kind of get used to that, but again in a safe kind of context. But it might also have just been more focusing drills. So we might have done some more mindfulness stuff so that you could really get into the here and now of what your body needed to do in that moment, rather than kind of getting hooked on the mind.
Yeah. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. So I was able to work through it just by getting on harder climbs, because that demanded more of my focus. I was motivated to do the climbs, and I almost said that forced me. That didn't force me. Yeah, I don't know. It gave me the nudge I needed, I guess, to kind of lean into that discomfort of falling, because I really wanted to do this climb, and that felt more important to me than the fear of coming off. It worked. So what are your thoughts about that approach? Was that a good approach? Could it have been better? What are your thoughts? I'm curious.
Well, it clearly works. So, I'm all for, if it works, go with it. But I guess it reminds me of something that's quite interesting, again, which I see a lot in climbers. And if we think of, one of the theories about our emotional systems is we have a drive system, a threat system, and a kind of a self-soothing system. And what I see in climbers often is this very overdeveloped drive system, and sometimes quite a developed threat system as well. But the self-soothing, that ability to be kind to yourself and compassionate around difficult emotions, is often quite underdeveloped, shall we say. So the tendency is to kind of push through, or to be quite self-critical, quite self-depreciating, kind of beat yourself up when things don't go so well. And sometimes there can be mileage in developing that kind of more compassionate self-responses to kind of even out those systems so that they're a bit more in balance, I guess. But, a lot of really elite athletes, their drive system is massively well developed, and that's what makes them great athletes. So you have to kind of think about everything that we do is for good reason. Everything that we do has pros and it has cons, So if there's more self-compassion, maybe the systems are a bit more balanced, maybe there's less drive, for example. So it sounds like you chose an intervention for yourself that kind of went with that drive, and allowed you to really focus. For your general well-being, I might be thinking about developing more on the self-soothing, self-compassionate kind of behaviors, perhaps.
Yeah, it is interesting. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about is some of the cultural narratives and internalized scripts that we have as climbers. And, hearing you kind of reflect that back to me, I'm realizing like there was definitely a lot of that wrapped up in my desire to overcome fear of falling. Like that was definitely how I thought about it, like I need to get over this. Like, this is embarrassing. Like I want to be able to take these big whips and just try these hard things and really not be seen as being afraid. And, I don't even know where that comes from exactly, but it's just something that, I don't know, especially as a male too, there's like even more of a cultural narrative around men, should be tough and just be able to put their head down and power through and things like that. But yeah, I have this example in front of me of, being brave and pushing through, and this narrative that we all kind of buy into, that climbers shouldn't get scared and should man up and just deal with it. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, if you have thoughts that are coming to mind for you.
Yeah, I think a few things. I was just thinking about this idea of conquering, like we're always conquering, aren't we? Well, the media reports, people as conquering. Right. This idea of kind of, overcoming and so on. And I think coupled with that, you've got this narrative around fear being irrational. Fear of falling is irrational because, boulder climbs are really safe and trad gear is really good these days, and we have great bouldering mats. But actually falling fear of falling is an innate fear. It's one of the first fears that you notice in babies. If you bring a baby down really quickly, they will do the Moro reflex, where they kind of startle and they kind of throw themselves out to break the fall and then kind of clasp in like this. And that's one of the first reflexes that a child has. I think it's kind of hardwired into us, actually. So it's not irrational. It's certainly pretty sensible to have some awareness of risk, because otherwise, people end up having short lifespans. So I can sort of see that maybe evolutionary wise, we've evolved to be mindful of these risks, but our narrative is all about being brave and conquering and overcoming, and it's all irrational. And I just feel like if you buy into that, it really doesn't help you to tackle some of these worries that come up and to accept them. You need to accept them fully for what they are in order to be able to work with them, I guess. So I would never say for myself that I am over my, my performance blocks, or that I'm over my fears of falling. What I say is I do get scared climbing. I do get scared of falling. And I need to do certain things to stay on top of that fear and make climbing an enjoyable experience for me. So that means for me, having a really good mental warm-up, it means making sure that my internal arousal levels are pretty low before I start. And I might do some stretching and breathing and yoga, mindfulness, whatever, to try to get into the right frame of mind for climbing. And I really take my time with it and try and keep on top of my anxiety levels as I'm climbing. But if I just try and push through, I wouldn't do any of those things. And I'm more likely then to bump into a situation which is really, I guess, traumatic. We're kind of setting ourselves up for possibly some really big issues where, we push through until we can't anymore. And a lot of the climbers I work with, they have had previous kind of traumas where they've had a bad fall, or they've had a really bad beeling experience, or they've had an experience where they felt really ostracized within a group or something like that. So there's some really powerful stuff that can go on, I think, when we buy into those narratives and we don't sort of put our hands up and say, I get scared. I'm human. I get scared.
And we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by Grasshopper Climbing. I got to climb with Boone Speed and try out the Grasshopper board for the first time last summer when I was in Salt Lake, and I immediately fell in love with the Grasshopper board. I'm an engineer, and whenever I climb in a new gym or on a new kind of training board, I'm always noticing little things that bug me and that I would change. With the Grasshopper board, I can honestly say I wouldn't change a thing. They put a ton of thought into their hold shaping and their layout, and I think this board has the highest bang for your buck training value of any board I've ever climbed on. I totally got my ass kicked trying a bunch of V7s that day with Boone. They were super fun to climb on, and they felt hard for the right reasons. Not weird or tweaky. The movement was complex and interesting, and you had to get the body positions right, but it was super powerful as well, and it requires you to try really hard to hang on with your fingers. You really have to grip the holds actively, which is super good for training, in my opinion. That's something that I definitely need to work on. And the best part is, because the angle is adjustable, the board is for everybody. No matter what level you are currently at in your climbing ability, the Grasshopper board has thousands of possible climbs you can do. It's like having an entire climbing gym right in your home or garage. They even have a sport climbing feature that allows you to climb routes. The lights change as you climb up and down and around on the board for up to 100 moves in a row. I personally think the Grasshopper board is the best climbing training tool I've ever seen. But don't take my word for it, because the folks at Grasshopper believe in their product and they just want you to try it out and see for yourself. If you want to learn more, head over to grasshopperclimbing.com or check them out on Instagram at grasshopperclimbing. And if you love what you find and decide to invest in your very own Grasshopper board, be sure to tell them I sent you, because the folks at Grasshopper are offering you guys, listeners to this podcast, $500 off when you order a fully kitted out 8x10 foot board. That's their smallest board. And you can save even more than that if you upgrade to a larger board. Again, that's grasshopperclimbing.com to learn more and connect with their sales team. And be sure to tell them I sent you to save $500 or more on your very own Grasshopper. And now back to the show. You said something really interesting. You just threw out the phrase mental warm up. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear more about your mental warm up and what you might recommend for people listening. Because something that's challenging about this conversation, but I also appreciate about you, is that you have this very individual approach to your work, to your mental coaching, because every single person is different. Their goals are different. Their experience is different. Their fears are different. So that's great, but it makes it really hard to give people actionable advice in this conversation. Yeah, but absolutely. But I want to try. I want to try doing that right now, and I think it'd be really interesting to start with that mental warm up, what that looks like for you, and what you've seen help some of your clients who struggle with fear of falling.
Yeah, so I think, again, one of the things that people tend to do is they think they need to get themselves psyched up to climb really well. And my experience is most people that I've coached is a very tiny percentage who need to do that. So climbing is a complex task. For complex tasks, we need lower levels of internal arousal, so physiological arousal, nervous system arousal. Easy tasks, sure, you do need to get pumped up for it. And that's why I think some of the psychology or the sports psychology around climbing is quite different to things like running, for example, because running it's not a complex activity. There's maybe race strategy that's difficult, but the activity itself, the risks are fairly well defined in terms of usually injury or maybe getting elbowed by someone else, or maybe, whether you win or lose the race, but there's not multiple risk factors to consider. So we have to think of climbing as this complex task. And most people who feel anxiety tend to have a very reactive nervous system. Yeah. So what we want to do is we want to try to bring the arousal levels down. So that could be anything that kind of lengthens the muscles, like yoga might be really good for that, some stretching. For me, what I like to do is I like to try to still my mind. So I'm kind of breathing is settling. So I'm doing more diaphragmatic breathing, slower breathing. I might be doing some kind of concentration type meditation where I'll just look at a piece of rock, get really interested in the colors and so on, and just try to focus on that and not get hooked by other thoughts. But it's very much a calming kind of activities that I would engage in. I might do a little bit of bouldering around at the bottom of the crag, but I'll try and do that in a very slow and quiet way, so I won't make any noises. And what I'm aiming to do there is just to slow everything down, steady everything down. And that's, for me, is my mental warm-up. Now, there are some people, a very small proportion, I think, where I've suggested, you need to do some jumping jacks, get the heart rate going, get pumped up for this, do some kind of shouting or whatever. But it's relatively rare. And those are people maybe who have very unreactive nervous systems. They're just like, they're so laid back. You could put a bomb underneath them and nothing would happen, So, but most people, they need to calm things down. So we need to think about quietening type activities. And we also need to think about, again, if focus is an issue, what are you doing before you climb? Are you, tying in and chatting and looking at the route all at the same time? That's not getting yourself into a single point of focus. And that's probably, again, what a lot of people need to do. So it's about thinking. What I do is I encourage the people I coach to think about, okay, when have you climbed at your best? Can you try and get that in your mind for me? Think about that. Okay, what do you remember about that day? How did it feel? What was the sensation like? Not, I climbed the route and it was brilliant, but what did you feel like internally? What did you do at the start? What was it about the conditions? What was going right for you? So there I'm kind of looking at, what can we pull out from their previous experiences that will give us some hints and tips about what's going to work for them to get them in the right kind of zone so they can perform at their best. But you'd be thinking about things like, what are the internal distractions? What are the external distractions? What is it about the route? What is it about conditions, the B layer, those kind of things? And trying to think about anything that might disrupt, like being tired or being hungry or, being very cold. I get really cold hands. So that's not a great climbing day for me if I start with really cold hands. It's trying to think about all the factors that might become distracting thoughts for you, I guess, and trying to address those. And again, that involves a lot of acceptance of, this is who I am, this is what impacts on me, this is what affects me. How am I going to manage these different factors? And it does take a bit of the spontaneity out of things, but if you want to improve and it's really important to you to get on top of those worries, then I think it's really well worth doing. Yeah,
man, there's so much that you just touched on that I think is worth expanding on.
Okay.
But yeah, I want to start with something that just came to mind for me. It was one of the last things that you just said, talking about this is me, accepting, like, this is me, this is my process, this is where I'm at and what I need to do. I'm really fascinated by how difficult it can be to embrace that. I struggle with that a lot, not necessarily in this context, but for a long time, I had a lot of hangups around being weird, being different than other people. Whatever that means. Like, we're all weird, we're all unique, and there's no such. I don't know if there is any such thing as normal. But I remember just being really preoccupied with with me versus normality for a long time. And it's taken me a lot of work and a lot of time in my adult life to start to recognize and accept things that work for me that are different from other people, and just learn to embrace them instead of diminishing them or hiding them or things like that. It's so interesting. It seems like it would be easier to do that. I don't really know what that is, because I'm perfectly happy to be vulnerable at the same time. But then in my behaviors, I've noticed that I tend to really keep a lot of things to myself and kind of diminish and hide things that feel other or different or weird compared to like normal society.
Yeah, I think you're touching upon something really interesting there. And another good example is, warm up. Most people I know I'll say, do you warm up? And they'll say, yeah, when I go to the climbing wall, I always warm up. And what about the crag? Oh no, I don't warm up. Why not? Because no one else warms up. So you're not doing something that's important to you because no one else is doing it. Okay. But I think again, there's a bit of a narrative in climbing, isn't it? Again, it's such an individualistic sport in many respects. And yet we don't want to stray from the norm. There's this there's like a double standard here, almost like this is what we say, but this is what we do. We expect people to be sticking to the rules, whatever the rules are. And quite a lot of them are unwritten, aren't they? About not top roping climbs first, or about not doing this, and, making sure that you're really clear about your ascents. And, I don't know, the person who climbs the hardest gets to choose where you go, or, there's lots of unwritten kind of rules. Wow. And I think the stuff around warm-ups or around rituals or quirks that we have, where a lot of people are hiding. And wouldn't it be fantastic if we could all just stop hiding?
Yeah, it really would. I mean, it's the irony here is that whenever I see someone at the crag who just embraces their quirks, I admire that. Like, I'm impressed by it, and I think it's really interesting, And if anything, I like hold that person in higher respects versus judging or thinking anything negative about them at all. So it's just strange to me. Like, I can see that in other people, and yet it's still, it's really taken a lot of work for me to be able to show up really transparently and honestly in some of my behaviors in front of other people.
I think I would link that back to what I talked about earlier about self-soothing. Those that bits that are about being compassionate. That's the bit that sometimes is missing or underdeveloped in climbers' personalities. And that's what's stopping us showing up authentically, I guess. We're policing ourselves without any need. So you've got a group of people who maybe don't identify with mainstream in some respects, and yet cannot quite allow themselves to just be vulnerable and be who they are. And then we have all these kind of interesting, narratives about bravery and toughness and so on being really important. So there's a lot of mismatches there I can see, and I think it causes us quite a lot of difficulty.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I can't help but notice that everything that we're talking about in this conversation is so relevant to everything else that we do in life.
Yeah.
Like, this is relevant for relationships, friendships, work, like, everything. It's all the same stuff. What do we do to help ourselves be more accepting of ourselves, as far as like ways in which that we're different from our perceived norm around us? Like, how do we get better at embracing that?
I think there's a couple of ways of approaching that, and it kind of, again, would depend a little bit, but I'll try and give an overview of both. So one would be to think about if I did spend 10 minutes meditating at the crag before I got on a route, what would be so terrible about that? What would be the worst that might happen? And we might do some kind of reframing around those underlying beliefs, because when you drill down, you think actually nothing terrible would happen there. But you might also then ask, well, I don't know, people might laugh at me. And how likely is that to happen, really? On a 0 to 100%. And if it did happen, how terrible would it be? And what's the benefits of you, meditating for 10 minutes at the crag? Well, I get to be in the right frame of mind to send my route. So you might look to do some kind of reframing around that. And reframing is not about it's not about trying to replace the negative thoughts with positive ones. It's more about introducing doubts to some of our assumptions, I guess. Yeah. So you might look for evidence, when, like, for example, you said, when I see other people doing that, actually, I think it's really amazing. I really value that, respect them for doing it. So that kind of casts a little bit of doubt on this idea that if you do meditate for 10 minutes, you're really strange. So that's one way of kind of approaching it. The other way is simply to unhook from that and recognize it is just a thought. So there's a few different ideas around that you could use, but one of them I might be tempted to think about is, who is this character who is turning up in your mind and telling you that it's really weird to meditate for 10 minutes? What do they look like? If you drew them out and gave them a name, what would the name be? So that you can kind of name them and label them when they show up. So you might say, oh, it's Mrs. kind of no, don't do it, or something along those lines. Mrs. No has turned up again. It gives a little bit of humor. It helps you identify when you're getting hooked by that thought. And by doing that, what you're able to do then is step back and see it is just a thought. It's not reality. Yeah. So we often fuse with our thoughts and act as if they're real and happening right now, when actually they're just electrical impulses in our brain. Nothing more than that. Yeah. So there's that. What you might also do is something like a behavioral experiment, for example, where you might deliberately go to 3 different crags and meditate for 10 minutes and see what happens. So you treat it as an experiment. I'm going to collect some data. I'm going to be a scientist about this. Let's just see what happens. And that's another way of kind of casting some doubt on maybe this idea that meditating is really weird before you climb. So a couple of different ways of kind of doing it. Unhooking would be one. And that idea of, labeling who's showing up and what character they are, and so that you can kind of recognize them. And the other way would be trying to kind of cast doubt on that idea that it's really odd.
I love it. It's interesting. It's so, I just started doing therapy recently. I've just had a couple sessions, and one of the exercises that my therapist gave me was challenging negative thoughts, like to write down the negative thought that I'm having about whatever it is. Like, an example would be, my work isn't as valuable if I don't work as much as I possibly can. Like if I don't fill my schedule with productivity, then I'm not creating as much value as I could, and that's bad, So, and I have this worksheet that he gave me to really just look for evidence, like you said, for and against those negative thoughts, and they just start to unravel. Like you really scrutinize them,
yes,
and look for evidence, and there's nothing there. There's nothing beneath it. There's no substance, but that's underlying that fear. It's just this, like you said, this chemical impulse. And I found it really helpful, but it's fascinating how similar that is to what you're talking about.
I think what's really important with climbing as well is that you need different techniques at different times. So the thought challenging is not so helpful when you're actually climbing, because in that moment, what you need to do is you need to unhook from the thoughts and get back into your body, and actually to do the climbing. So I wouldn't necessarily get people to do that, but I'd be more inclined to get them to do some unhooking techniques, or simply to do a grounding technique, something like pushing into their feet and really trying to feel the rock under their feet, for example, because that's more likely to be effective in a moment of high stress where you actually need to be moving, But when you get down and you're starting to beat yourself up about how scared and so on, and how that was terrible, and you took hours on the route, and all these kind of things, that's when your thought challenging can be really helpful. So to come at it from the two ends can be really, really useful.
I want to circle back to breathing and talk a little bit more about breathing techniques, because I actually, I was looking at your website this morning and I found a free breathing audio download in your shop, and I thought that was really interesting. So I clicked on that. It took me to a YouTube video that's like 3 minutes long where you guide people through breathing. But I think I'll share that in the show notes for this episode, if you're okay with that, for people to try it out.
Sure.
But I'd love to just hear you describe it. Like if someone, assuming that most people listening to this, if they struggle with fear of falling for any reason, it's most likely that they need to bring the anxiety down rather than amping themselves up. They need to bring themselves down and calm down. What would that look like? How would you use breathing to assist with that? I assume this is like at the start of the climbing day, as you're warming up, or before a red point try or things like that. But what would that look like in practice?
Yeah, and you're right. And it can also be en route as well. So I might be having regular check-ins on the route, depending, just to try and keep on top of anxiety levels. But essentially, when we get stressed, two things tend to happen. One would be the kind of breath holding, that people tend to do. And the other would be this very shallow chest breathing. So relaxed breathing, which is kind of good for our nervous system, it kind of settles things down, if you will. That comes from our belly or from our diaphragm. So what that looks like is if you just put a hand on your chest and a hand on your belly, as you're breathing in, it's almost like a balloon expanding in your stomach. And then as you breathe out, your belly kind of contracts. So that's your relaxed breathing. Now, the problem is when people think about breathing, they often think about taking a deep breath in. But what that does is just gets all the breathing into the chest, and we get kind of tense shoulders, and we actually increase the tension around it. So I'm often encouraging people to take a long, slow breath out and then to try to breathe from the belly. And that could be about pushing the belly into the harness, for example, into the waistband of your harness, and then breathing out. But longer, slower out breaths, breathing from the diaphragm, and also breathing with quite a relaxed face. So kind of, you might have heard on the audio, kind of horse lips sound, which I can't do very easily. But kind of thing.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
It works. It never does when I have to demo it. But those are some of the sort of techniques which, again, are associated with just dampening down that kind of over-arousal, I guess, in our nervous system. So that's what we want to be focused on. But I often get people to practice the transition. So people will tend to know, or you'll be able to observe very quickly, that they are either holding their breath and getting very stressed, or they're panting and kind of very shallow breathing. So I get them to practice the transition from that, whatever their thing is, into the relaxed breathing. So what happens sometimes is people will just learn the breathing exercises, but they don't practice the transition. And what you really need is to be able to switch from when you notice that your breathing has gone astray, you need to switch that into this more relaxed breathing. It's kind of hard to do while you're climbing. And I think certainly, the more overhanging, the more sort of core tension you have, the harder it is to do. But it is entirely possible to do. It's just something that we need to practice. Yeah, so I think we're starting to understand a bit more, like some of these techniques, which perhaps come from yoga or whatever, we're starting to understand from a scientific point of view that there's good evidence for them working in terms of this dampening down of the nervous system. So some of the old wisdom are perhaps coming out with new eyes.
That's great. Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me is that seems like it would be especially helpful and relevant to do on the route when you're resting, like when you're at a stance, when you're at a rest. That's when I think it's so common to get in your head about the next section, about the crux, about the fall, about the run out, whatever it is. And it seems like practicing that breathing at a rest would really help recenter, but also just be really restful. Like, really, really help get the most recovery that you possibly can.
Yes.
How long should someone do this? Like if it's the start of the climbing day and they're about to start their warm up, what might this breathing practice look like?
Yeah, so ideally they've practiced a lot in conditions of low stress. And so they have it without thinking too much. But again, once you're at the crag, often your attention's a bit all over the place. So it might be feeling a bit more effortful. So I'd want them to settle into it for, at least 3 to 5 minutes, really at the start of the climb, but then perhaps to pick some spots where you might check in again with your breathing and just make sure that you breathe out. So it could be after placing a piece of gear or clipping. Every time I clip, I try and breathe out, for example. So you get into a bit of a rhythm. So the idea is not to let the anxiety build as you get higher, which kind of often happens, but to try and keep on top of it, so that we are continuously kind of dampening things down. So you can't be aware of your breathing every single move, but you could check in at particular sections or clips or whatever. But I think, a cycle of sort of 3 minutes or so is good. you want to feel settled into it. And that's quite an individual thing. Some people are very practiced and they can find that they can just find themselves settling into it very quickly. Other people, it takes a lot longer to kind of settle the mind, tune out some of the distractions and just get into the breathing. So we're all different in that respect.
Got it. I'm curious about this. We've already talked about a lot of this, and this is going to be a little bit of a summary, but I think it'd be a really useful summary. I want to use the example of a climber who's a little bit over aroused as far as the energy that they're bringing to a red point attempt. Let's say they're tying in for a route that they've been trying. They feel anxious. And, I think this is so common. Like, in part, they're anxious because they really want to do the thing. So there's some expectation, there's some performance anxiety, things like that. There's also maybe one section of the climb where they're afraid of falling. It's this combination. And you mentioned something earlier, like our minds are jumping around. They're thinking about the crux, they're thinking about their belayer, they're thinking about their climbing shoes being slightly too tight. I don't know, slightly too worn out or something, or not broken in enough or whatever. A climber in that situation who just needs to bring their focus to something more specific, what might that look like? How would you coach someone through regaining a little bit more presence so that they can relax and hopefully perform their best on their project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm getting another "it depends" kind of
that's fine.
Response,
yeah,
which I'll try not to give that, because I think that's not always helpful. But I guess what I'm interested in with people is figuring out, when the anxiety shows up for you, what do you notice the most? Is it your mind jumping around? Is it that your breathing goes? Is it that you're very tense? Is it that you feel sick? Is it a lot of negative thoughts? Because that is going to really help me to understand whether we need to do more physical ways of bringing the arousal levels down, or whether we need to think about refocusing or grounding or unhooking. So that's the first thing, is try to figure out how does it mostly present itself for you? If there's things in there that we can deal with, then I would encourage people to have a bit of a plan to deal with them. So, for example, if the shoes, are too tight, say, okay, my shoes are too tight. Do I need to do something about this or not? Because again, the tendency is to try and avoid and to try and push the thoughts away. But that's not really going to help you. They're just going to keep coming back. The more we try not to think about something, the more likely we are to think about it. So don't think about pink elephants is a classic example. And you think about pink elephants. So, we need to try and deal with some of these things if we can. If it's somebody where it's a lot of critical thoughts, self-critical thoughts, worries about performance and so on, then I would be thinking about, okay, who's showing up here? What are the characters that are showing up? And I might be trying some of those techniques to try and observe and take a step back from that. I think it's really helpful to have a pre-climb routine that you use it's the same sort of 2 to 3 actions, maybe a focusing word or something, but you do that every time you climb, whether you're training or trying to send, or red pointing, or you're on the sun. So having a routine that you can use, again, is quite settling. So that's something we might have developed and practiced a lot, and then we kind of bring it to that red point. If it's somebody experiencing anxiety in a really physical way, for example, they know they hold their breath and they get very tight in the shoulders and so on, then I'd be encouraging them to do the diaphragmatic breathing, settle into that, and then to pick some other points where they'll do that on the route. And I guess if it's somebody where the mind is jumping around a lot, I might have been working on them with some kind of simple meditations or grounding techniques that get them located back into the here and now. So I think one of the things that destroys red points is predicting what's going to happen. And ideally we want that. This is where I think mindfulness can be really helpful, because mindfulness is a practice, as in meditation, but there's also mindfulness as an attitude. And that attitude is about curiosity and openness and allowing things to happen as they will. So that's where I think if somebody's particularly a red pointer, I would be trying to work on more of a mindful attitude for them, a curiosity. Let's see how this is going to pan out. So there's something in there as well, I think, about trusting that you've done the work and allowing your body to climb rather than kind of trying to over control it with these thoughts. So different, depending on how things are showing up for people, different approaches.
Thank you for all that. That was excellent. Yeah, it's incredibly helpful, I think. And I'm curious about the mindfulness thing and about meditation. You talked about meditation earlier, showing up and trying to meditate at the crag. And I've done quite a lot of meditation in different forms. And I found it to be incredibly helpful. And the form of meditation that's made the greatest impact by far for me is a mindfulness practice. Specifically, I use Sam Harris's Waking Up app. I find that very, very helpful, and it's something I've done for a long time and continue to do less regularly these days. I'd like to be more consistent with it. But what does meditation mean to you? What does it look like to you? Do you have any sort of app or guidance or recommendations that you give to clients who are interested in it? And actually, maybe even before that, I have no idea what people think of it, actually, that are listening to this. Like, it's become very normalized for me personally, but I'm sure that there's still many people listening that think it's religious or woo-woo or weird or who knows. But maybe first you can just talk about what meditation is to you, why you feel like it's important, and if you have a client come to you who's skeptical about it, but who you think would benefit from it, what's your sales pitch? What do you say, and how do you get buy-in from athletes?
I think that's a great question. And I think you're right. Some people are really skeptical about it. And I would say it doesn't suit everyone. So I would be wary about it if people have any experiences of dissociation, or they've got severe amount of trauma, or they've been hearing voices or something like that. I think they'll be quite cautious around that. And also, I think what I'm teaching with clients is kind of meditation light, as it were. So I'm not going into the kind of whole Zen practice that comes with some of that for people. If somebody's, I guess the way I would explain it is it's not about your mind never wandering, and you're not trying to reach some kind of Zen-like state. That's not it. What you're trying to do is notice when your mind wanders and gently bring it back to the present moment, or to whatever you're supposed to be focusing on, because some meditation is more of a focusing, kind of a concentration type meditation, whereas the mindfulness is more of a kind of diffuse, isn't it, being in the present moment. So different types of meditation. So ideally, it's that noticing quality, and it's the gently bringing it back to where you want it to be. And I think of it as a kind of your mind being like this puppy on one of these long extendable leads. You want to gently bring the puppy back to you. You don't want to yank it back. You don't want to get all cross about it. And it's not, the puppy never wanders because it has to explore, and the fact that our mind wanders is a fantastic quality. It helps us to problem solve. So we're never going to get rid of that. But what we want to do is to kind of to train it a little bit more so we can put our focus where we want it to be at any moment. For people who maybe would struggle with mindfulness, I really like a technique called the soles of the feet. And that is could be described as a grounding technique. But again, it's a sort of a concentration. It involves bringing your awareness into your toes, each toe in turn, feeling whatever's there, the ball of the foot, the heel of the foot, the whole foot. And I think every climber can buy into the fact that footwork is important. So that would be my sales pitch. If nothing else, this is going to give you a much better awareness of your feet. So let's go with that. But also it does help to sort of focus the mind. So I think that's a really good one. Some people find moving meditations a lot easier, particularly people who are quite busy, lots going on, quite energetic. Then the moving meditations, like walking meditations, can be really a lot easier than the sitting meditations for them. So again, there's a little bit about trying to find the right thing for the person in front of you. The benefits, I think, are huge. So you are learning to focus. I think there's some nice studies that show when people are experienced at meditating, the same parts of the brain light up as when you're in flow. So, we can sort of say that actually maybe what we're doing is creating the conditions for flow. And there's a lot of parallels there between flow and a kind of meditative state where passage of time is kind of skewed in some way. It feels like it took no time at all and you had all the time in the world at the same time. That kind of challenge state, but without threat, and that absolute absorption. So there's lots of parallels between those two things. And again, for climbers who've experienced flow states, it can be quite elusive, can't it? You experience it maybe once or twice, and you really want that feeling again where everything was just perfect. You almost weren't thinking, you were just climbing. But I think, again, that's another kind of good reason to practice meditation, is because of those parallels between the two states and creating those conditions of flow to happen.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you for all that.
Did I sell it to you?
Well, you didn't have to. You sold it really well. I'm already bought in. But I just want to share. I just want to share one of my own thoughts, or my own experience about why mindfulness has been so helpful for me. And using Sam Harris's app, it doesn't have to be that, obviously. Like, there's lots of ways to practice this stuff, but it's he often uses the breath as a focus point to just have something very specific, to really be noticing the sensation of breathing in your body as a way to bring your mind back to something when you find yourself wandering. But his pitch, which was really compelling to me and has really resonated, is that, like, our minds are trainable. We think of our bodies being trainable. We put all this energy into physical training and skill work and things like that, but we can also train our minds. And, the difference between being swept away by your thoughts, because we all have thoughts, that we all have all these different thoughts that come up for us all the time, and we can't make them stop. We can't really choose them or control them. They're just going to happen. But you can either be swept up in them without even realizing it and be really reactive and be kind of at the whims of wherever your mind goes and the fears that come up, or you can become a lot more observant and basically be able to just notice things but not identify with them. So for me, practicing mindfulness has made it so much easier to notice myself feeling something, but not like reacting or behaving from that place. Like, for example, if I get frustrated, whereas earlier in my life I might have lashed out and been angry or frustrated or said like a quippy, snappy comment that was hurtful to someone, like now I'm a lot better at being able to just notice, like, oh, that made me feel really frustrated. That's really interesting. Like, what's happening there? And then I get to choose. I have more agency to like choose how I respond. And it's not an overstatement to say that it is life-changing. It has been absolutely life-changing for me, and it feeds into climbing. It feeds into conversations and relationships and everything. I mean, everything. Like, our minds and our thoughts are us, So, that's my sales pitch. Or Sam's, rather. I'm just passing on Sam's sales pitch. But I mean, it's truly been remarkable, and it's something that these days I place just as much value on that as physical training or any other sort of thing that that we all do to try to improve. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you're touching on something really important there, which is this ability to observe, is kind of cultivating that observer position, isn't it? It's getting in touch with that part of us that is separate to our thoughts. It's a core us somehow. And to be able to cultivate that and not get swept up in the thoughts is brilliant. But we already have, even if people who don't meditate already have those experiences. So, the million and one thoughts that go through your mind, which might be, I don't know, I need to pick up some milk, and I better dust that shelf over there. And what's that noise I can hear? We don't act on all of those. But so why are we acting on particular thoughts? And I think helping people to understand that they already have that ability, they just need to learn how to turn the volume up on that. Is really helpful.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. Well, this has been amazing. I think this has been really valuable, and I just want to I want to give us a chance to hear about your book before I let you go here. But before that, I want to ask if are there any topics around fear of falling that we haven't talked about yet that you feel are important, and or any actionable tips that we haven't covered yet that you think would be important to share in this conversation?
I'll probably think of loads tomorrow. But right now, I guess
that's how it works. Yeah. Right. Well, I can always have you back on. Yeah. This has been amazing. So I'd love to talk to you again. Yeah.
I guess the key thing for me is to think about falling practice is the last thing you do rather than the first thing you do. I think there is as we've talked about through this conversation, there are so many other things you can learn, and that should be learned first. That will, if you do end up doing falling practice, it will give you a better experience of falling practice. But I wouldn't have that as your number one go-to, because I think it's a high risk strategy, and it's something that's quite hard to do, I think, alone without maybe a skillful observer, skillful coach to help you along, inadvertently maybe conditioning more fear. So I would say, think about all the other skills you can learn. Breathing, you can learn, muscle tension release, you can learn grounding techniques, you can learn sort of thought unhooking, you can learn meditation, you can learn having a pre-climb routine. There are so many different things that you can do. And to limit that intervention to just falling practice, I think, is missing out on things which would be beneficial to the whole of your climbing and your well-being as well. So that would be my top tip, really.
That's great. Yeah, I think this is worth asking, actually, because I imagine that there's a lot of people listening to this who tune in for performance tips. They're attached to that drive, right? I feel this way sometimes. Like, I really love the drive that I have to climb harder and the drive that I have to do other things well. Like, that's brought me a lot of the best things in my life, but I also have to learn how to balance that and turn it off sometimes, ironically, to get my best performances. So I'm curious if there's anyone out there who is hearing you talk about, bringing that energy down and being more acceptant. Does that threaten performance? Can we have both? Like, can we perform our best if we start working more on the letting go and the accepting and letting go of the pushing through and, the being brave and things like that? What has been your experience with your clients? Like, are you through this process, are people climbing harder, I guess? And what would be your encouraging message for the hard charging athletes out there who are maybe a little bit too wrapped up in the drive and the wanting to perform and things like that?
I think that's a great question. And I guess, sometimes there's a worry that if we let go of that hard driving side, that we won't perform. That is a worry that I need this. I need to be really hard on myself and really critical and really pushing all the time, because if I don't, then I'm not going to achieve the things I want to achieve. And there's a little bit in there about trusting that actually that drive is still going to be very, very well developed. I think there's a lot to be learned from practicing non-attachment to outcome. So you can use your drive to get really involved in the process. So what skills do I need to climb harder? Mental skills or physical skills. But we're setting more process kind of goals for ourselves. But if you're very attached to outcomes and that your drive is all about the outcome, then I think you're probably missing some performance data that can really help you to develop. But also you're going to be setting yourself up for more disappointing experiences. So it's kind of a switch from achievement to mastery, if that makes sense. And I think that. Actually mindfulness really prepares us quite well for that curiosity. And developing that is never going to be a hindrance to performance.
That's amazing. I mean, it's interesting because I actually talk about that quite a lot. The craft of climbing and mastery and the process, like really, because that's something I'm, still practicing all the time, is being more invested and interested and getting more gratification out of the process versus the outcome. But you just capture that so well. I love how you presented that. That was amazing. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay. Let's talk about your book, Smart Climbing. Tell me what the book is, and I'd love to hear what made you want to write this book in particular.
I always find it really hard to talk about this because I think in many ways, the book has been in my mind for a really long time, and that I've delivered a lot of workshops over the years. I work with a lot of different clients, and I think in many respects, it was kind of there already, but I was approached by Sequoia Books, by the publisher Andy there, and he said, have you thought about writing a book? And it was lockdown, and you know how people are kind of scratching around for things to do sometimes in lockdown. So I started to write it. And of course, what happened really was, because of the way I work, my lockdown didn't really transpire to be this experience of having nothing to do. I ended up still working online because that was possible, looking after the kids and so on. So I squeezed writing the book into mornings, an hour each morning, 5 days a week over
Wow.
kind of about 6 months. But the writing, it was fairly easy, I think, in many respects, because I wanted to synthesize all the things that I'd coached or delivered in workshops over the years. And crucial really for me to have both a performance and a well-being slant on it. So I wanted to touch on some of the things we've talked about today, like setting process goals, not just outcome goals, like identifying your values and what is important to you about climbing. You know, is it climbing hard, or is it the fact that you love being elegant in your movement, or is it that you love climbing with friends or being out in nature? You know, what are the kind of values attached to that, and understanding your own psyche and motivations a little bit more, so that you can tailor any interventions around meeting those values. But I also wanted to deliver a big section on anxiety, because I think it's been really undercovered in lots of previous climbing psychology books. It's had maybe a chapter at best. So I wanted to really delve into all the different types of anxieties, like worries about being judged at the climbing wall or judged at the crag, perfectionism, etc. Fear of falling. I wanted to go into the whole gamut of those and really give them some depth and detail. And then I also wanted to capture kind of tailoring the more generic sports psychology interventions, like visualization or like self-talk or focus and flow, but tailor that for climbing as well, so that the exercises would be really specific to climbing, because I think there are some key differences there with other sports. And then also to touch on some of the stuff which I think has been really current around mental health, around eating, diet, and to kind of, I guess, give some hints about how we might develop that positive well-being, I guess. That, climbing's a fantastic sport, isn't it? It captures people from very young to, I still see people climbing into their late 70s, at the local crags and gyms. What an amazing age range for a sport. So how do we keep ourselves mentally well for the whole that kind of lifetime of climbing? So I wanted to kind of try and bring it all together into a book, and to make it really practical, so that it was scientific, but it looked real and relatable for people, with some little case studies just to show how that might look in real life, I guess. So the writing was easy. The editing was just torturous. I'm not somebody who likes editing. I like to kind of write it and move on. And I almost feel like by this point, I've almost moved on from the book. It's like it's done and dusted, and I've got more ideas about where next. But hopefully I remembered what was in it.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I've had a chance to look at it, and just hearing your description of it makes me want to just read it cover to cover. So you sold it really well. I do want to ask you about the nutrition thing. And I don't necessarily, this could be a whole 2-hour conversation, so I don't necessarily want to make you feel like you need to give me any long answers or anything. Maybe you can just give me a little bit of an overview to get people curious about what's in the book. But I love that you mentioned that, because, we have such a tendency in today's world, especially in Western society, to compartmentalize different parts of ourselves, right? Like, I'm working on my mental game, or I'm working on my finger strength, or I'm working on my technique, or I'm working on sleeping better, or I'm working on weight loss, whatever. But all of these things are connected, and food absolutely has an effect on our minds and so many other things. So I would just be curious to hear from you, like, if you had to just really give a brief summary of what is in the book, like what associations or themes or connections have you noticed between your clients' nutrition and some of these things that you're working on with their mindset, whether that's anxiety or whatever else? But yeah, are there themes there?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's really current, isn't it? There's been a few documentaries recently, and also climbers, elite climbers coming out and talking about disordered eating or body image and so on. And, we are in a kind of a gravitational sport where, leanness is kind of supposed to be helpful. But I think, we're not just heads on top of bodies. The mind and body are connected. And what I often see is maybe an extension of the kind of overdoing the drive and the threat and not doing the self-soothing coming out in kind of eating patterns as well. So, again, that kind of people being very rigid around what they will and won't eat. And there may be some scientific reasons behind that, but sometimes I think it's more about how they feel about themselves than it is really about what's the right thing to be doing nutritionally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it could be an extension of this kind of self-criticism or a rigidity or a perfectionism. And there's a really close link between perfectionism and, eating disorders. So I think those are some of the things that sometimes come up is when, a lot of climbers are very perfectionistic. It's not always a bad thing, but it can have quite a dark side to it. And so I think it's just being mindful of that, thinking about how kind of all or nothing thinking, which typically comes with perfectionism, might be impacting on fueling, for example, and optimal fueling. And I had quite a lot of conversations with a nutritionist, Rebecca Dent, just talking about what's out there in terms of information. And a lot of the nutritional information isn't by nutritionists. It's not, it's not by registered dietitians. It's by climbers kind of experimenting and interpreting the science. But I think we have to be mindful of that lens of our maybe overdeveloped drive and threat and underdeveloped self-soothing. So something that kind of, I think I just wanted to highlight to people that, there may be some risk factors inherent in our climbing culture, in the kind of media reporting and how we are showcasing very lean, very muscular bodies, sometimes very thin bodies. And there's links with our kind of personality, I guess, and to kind of just give people a heads up that if they notice certain things, then maybe it might be worth getting some outside help on this. Because in my experience, once people start down the slope of disordered eating or eating disorder, it doesn't tend to get better by itself. You do need some extra help to kind of get through it, because the leaner you are and once you get below a certain body weight, your thinking patterns become even more rigid and it becomes harder to get yourself out of it.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So it's more about all of that than specific foods or... Yeah, gotcha.
I'm not qualified to talk about that.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, that's fascinating. I don't know if you realize this, but you just described me. Yeah, I don't know if you know that, but I've talked about disordered eating, my experience with disordered eating on this show, and it absolutely came from that place, that perfectionism and that all or nothing way of thinking. Like discovering some like having some light bulb moments around nutrition and breaking down some assumptions that were actually really helpful initially and moving my nutrition in the right direction, but then just like putting my foot down to the floor with that and taking it like way farther than it needed to go. And I mean, you said something great too, like there might be some scientific reasons to eat certain ways. And that's what makes it so complicated too, right? Like nutrition, I really still believe and truly believe that it does matter, and what we eat is what makes us us. Like that's what we use to rebuild our muscles and everything. So of course it matters, but the all or nothing approach really backfired for me. And I'm still learning, like, what is the, how much energy should I put into this? Because I've learned that I can't just eat whatever the hell I want all the time. Like that doesn't make me feel good. That doesn't really help me perform well. But having like a spreadsheet that tells me what I should be eating today, which I have had for years of my life, probably isn't the way to go either. So yeah, anyway, all that to say, I really resonate with what you just shared, and I appreciate you sharing it.
It's just finding that balance, isn't it? And like you say, it's complicated because we do need to be mindful of what we eat. We're starting to understand the role of gut bacteria as well, of mental health and so on. But I think it's, again, sometimes unpicking that, about why, what am I really doing here? What's really driving this? And understanding ourselves a little bit better would be helpful in terms of trying to achieve that balance. So we're not going too far to one extreme or the other.
I'm putting you on the spot with this question, but I wanted to ask you, is there anything from your book that you are still working on in your own climbing?
Oh God, loads. Yeah.
I love it. Can you give me some examples?
Absolutely loads. Yeah. I think I've had a really complicated relationship with climbing since having my kids, actually. And I think before having them, I was climbing really, really well. I felt like I had all my ducks in a row. Everything was just as I wanted it. And, with my first, I climbed till I was about 8 months pregnant, no issues whatsoever. And the second one nearly destroyed me, I have to be frank. So, he lay really awkwardly from really early on. He was kind of sideways jammed across my stomach. And I was really uncomfortable. I'm managing a toddler and so on. And then not long after he was born, I got really sick with pneumonia. And then I just didn't really recover for about 4 years. And It took a really long time to get to where I am now, and lots of investigations and trying to figure out what was going on. But having these repeated chest infections, repeated joint pain, repeated temperatures, this ongoing picture of being really fatigued and so on. And so I think what I am working on is that balance word again, which is, what would happen is I would be well and I would try and go straight back into where I was before. And of course, I wasn't actually well enough to do that. I wasn't fit enough. I then would be very hard on myself about, gosh, you can't even do this anymore, so very self-critical. And then I'd crash and be ill again and back to square one. And then you try and pick yourself up. And so I guess I was battling with, in the face of what was a chronic illness that was quite unpredictable, and lots of anxieties and question marks about what might be going on, just battling with staying motivated. What's the point if I can't climb regularly? That kind of stuff. And my technique's still there, but I have no strength. I lost a lot of muscle mass. So again, that just frustration. So I feel like I'm kind of coming out of that now, both physically and mentally. But what I've had to do is be really, really careful about the expectations I've been putting on for myself, and to really try hard to develop that acceptance and curiosity. And that has involved lots of kind of unhooking, who's showing up here? Is this the old stuff from gymnastics again? Still, I'm 47 years old. This is like really old stuff now. Trying to manage that, trying to aim for balance and not doing this kind of yo-yo thing where you're all in and then all out because you're sick, but trying to aim for something that's sustainable in the long term. And I think my interest, my values really around sustainability has really grown in the time. And that's been something that's been really helpful to me, is to have that as a kind of a guiding compass, is what is sustainable for me, for my health, for my family, what's sustainable for my climbing. And the climbing doesn't look anything like it used to look. Now it is taking advantage of small bits of time and going bouldering and, going to places, because I like exploring and trying new stuff. I have that kind of real novelty thing that I love. So I've got the newest guidebook for North Wales and trying to go and tick various things off in the guidebook, just going to places, not to tick off the problems, because I don't really have that strength, particularly at the moment, but to keep the exploring thing and to keep the sustainability things at the heart of what I'm doing. And we're all a work in progress, and I'm no different to anyone else in that respect. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's really generous of you to be that open and to share it. I'm sure it's relatable, and just speaks to you that you're living it. You're the real deal. You're not just writing about it. You're practicing it yourself. I think that's just such a powerful reminder to hear that. Yeah. So
I think you need to taste test things yourself, don't you, to make sure that they're worth going in the book. So, yeah, absolutely.
Well, on that note, who is this book for?
I hope it's for anyone who wants to understand their psyche a bit better and to learn some new skills, or maybe to consolidate some old mental skills as well. I hope it's kind of wide-ranging enough that it will be good for people who are starting out thinking about mental training, and also for people who are more seasoned at it. And maybe there's some bits in there that's broader and about well-being and kind of longevity in the sport. So I hope it's for everyone. Maybe apart from complete beginners, I would say, get your climbing going first, and then maybe come to the mental side of it a little bit. but yeah, I hope so. And I hope coaches can find it helpful as well, although it wasn't necessarily written for coaches, but I hope there's lots of questions in there designed to get people thinking that I think coaches could probably use.
Oh, that's great. Awesome. And is it available for purchase now?
It is, yeah. I think it's on the Sequoia Books website, and it's on Amazon and Waterstone's various online kind of retailers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'll put links to it in the show notes for people that want to get a copy. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah. You said that you wrote it and you almost feel like it's just done and behind you and you're already on to the next thing. What's next for you? What are you excited about right now?
I'm really, well, what's imminently next is next week, it's school holidays here. And so it's a family trip to Fontainebleau.
Oh, amazing.
Which we're really looking forward to. It will be very hot, I think, but, it's the kids really enjoy bouldering and scrambling around in the forest and biking. So we're going to do some of that.
Oh, that's perfect.
So that'll be really good. And I guess, I'm also this weekend, I'm off to the Women's Trad Festival in Ireland to deliver a workshop. I've got kind of thoughts about maybe writing something for coaches as well, and maybe thinking about the kind of coaching relationship and how to really foster that connection. But I'm not starting it yet. My husband will kill me, I think, if I start another book. I'm just going to let it brew for a while, maybe another 10 years or so.
Nice. There you go. Well, this has been amazing. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I think this has been a really valuable conversation. It's given me a lot to be thinking about. I'm excited to dive back into your book, and just appreciate you. Thank you so much for doing this. Is there
you're welcome.
I want to ask before I let you go, is there any final words, any final thoughts or messages you want to put out there for people listening? Something to, a question you would ask them to get them thinking, anything like that you want to leave people with in this conversation?
I would say for anyone who's thinking about mental training to go right back to that very first time you went climbing and what did it give you, and to really think about what excited you about climbing, because I think sometimes in that progression, we get a bit lost in chasing the next grade or the next challenge. But to really think about what was it that you first got out of that very first experience of climbing? What did you love about it? What hooked you at that point? And to try to make sure that any mental training you do directly links back to those early motivations. Because I think that's what's going to keep you going and kind of keep you interested for the long term in the sport. Riding out any kind of difficulties, any health concerns, any injuries, and so on. It's just trying to connect with that. Those early exciting moments. What was it about that?
Oh, that's great. I'm gonna be thinking about that question for the rest of the day, I think. Yeah,
Excellent.
That's really interesting. I love that. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it, Stephen, and thanks so much for having me on. It was really helpful to have your side of things as well and some examples to kind of work with. That was really, really good for me to kind of have some material to work with. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, perfect. It's helpful for me too. Every time I open up and share my own experience, even just saying it out loud, it's always interesting how much you learn. Just putting things into words and describing your experience to someone else. It's like I've made some connections actually in this conversation that I hadn't made before. So,
brilliant, excellent. Oh, that's really good to hear. Yeah.
All right.
Fabulous.
Well, I'll let you get back to your day before the iPad dies, and you've got.
Yeah. So far, so good. They're like magnets, TV and magnets. Yeah.
Amazing. The best babysitter.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh, thanks so much, Stephen.
Right.
Take care.
Thank you. You too. Have a great day.
Bye.
Hey friends, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Rebecca Williams as much as I did. If you want to check out her book, I put links to Climb Smarter right there in your podcast app. You can find links to where you can buy it if you scroll down. And before you go, don't forget to check out the Arc'teryx film Free as Can Be. I watched it a couple weeks ago. I absolutely loved it. And if you love climbing, if you love Yosemite climbing, especially if you love adventure and trad climbing and the allure of El Capitan and Yosemite, I'm sure you'll dig it. Head over to YouTube and search for Arc'teryx, free as can be, or use the direct link right there in your podcast app to watch the full 31-minute film for free. Also, be sure to check out Rhino Skin Solutions. These are earth-grown products made to help support your precious skin so you can sweat less, go longer, and climb harder on the rock. My favorite product by far is the Repair Cream, which does wonders to help my skin heal faster between climbing sessions. Check out rhinoskinsolutions.com and use code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off your next order. And finally, don't forget to check out the Grasshopper board. Check them out on Instagram at Grasshopper Climbing or visit grasshopperclimbing.com to find out where you can find a board near you to try it out for yourself. Tell them I sent you, and when you're ready to get your hands on your very own Grasshopper board, you can save a lot of money on your order. And that is it, my friends. Thank you for listening to the very end. I appreciate you. I hope you found something helpful in this episode. Best of luck with your climbing and your performance and your fear of falling. Let us know how it's going for you. Reach out if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you. I hope you have an amazing week, and we will see you next time.